The Nintendo Entertainment System, sometimes referred to as the NES, NES or NES, was the first home console I played for any decent length of time. In the UK we were more used to home computers like the BBC Micro Spectrum or Commodore 64, and the NES wasn't as popular as it was stateside. If you're watching from North America, chances are the NES was your first love when it came to gaming. Despite having a fair few duffers, the console had a great library of games, but there are also numerous games that never saw the light of day. Join me as we take a look at 15 of the many unreleased games for Nintendo's 8-bit console. Despite being on the market for merely a year and having only 2 shit games, the Power Glove became part of gaming history due to its retro futuristic look, and is still being referenced in popular culture to this day. The Terror of Tech Town is another game that was in development from Mattel for their Power Glove, in which the player would guide a robot hand through a network of futuristic buildings, with the aim being to manipulate objects and solve puzzles in order to escape from the titular Tech Town. The game was mentioned in the media alongside other planned Power Glove releases and was penned for an early 1991 release, but in the end only Super Glove Ball and Bad Street Brawler went to market for the accessory. Cheetahmen 2 is a side-scrolling action game and a sequel to the original, which appeared on the Action 52 cart on the NES in 1991. Although entirely finished, the game was never released despite the production of carts. These Cheetahmen 2 carts are actually Action 52 carts, which were no doubt in abundance due to the shocking quality, but have a gold sticker indicating that the cart contains Cheetahmen 2. In the mid-90s these carts were illegally obtained and sold to the public, so these rare copies can often be bought online. The ROM has subsequently been dumped online as well, so you can play it using an emulator or an EverDrive. Gameplay wise, it reuses a lot of audio and graphical assets from the original Cheetahmen, but has mostly original levels bar the last 2 which were lifted from its predecessor. Not a great game, so no real loss here. Worth mentioning, if only for the amusing name, Super Dog Booby Akachan Daibuka no Maki, apologies for the butchered pronunciation, was an action platformer in development by Jaleco and Taito in the early 90s. The name roughly translates as Super Dog Booby Baby Adventure Volume. Despite appearing in a Japanese magazine and a playable demo allegedly being shown at a 1991 event, the game was never released for some reason. Sunman was an action platformer / scrolling beat 'em up being developed for the NES by Sunsoft for release in 1992. Originally intended to be a Superman game, for some reason Sunsoft couldn't secure the license from DC, so the protagonist was changed to Sunman. His overall design remained largely the same, so Sunman's outfit resembles that of Superman. Not exactly sure why Sunman was cancelled, but in 1992 the console wasn't exactly in its youth, and the game looks average at best. In a way, the game did eventually see the light of day. Sunsoft's Mega Drive game Superman the Man of Steel, or just Superman on the Genesis in North America, is essentially Sunman, but with its initially intended Superman license. A lot of the gameplay and design is similar or identical to Sunman's NES prototype. Titan Warriors was being developed by Capcom in 1988 and was to be a sequel to their very first game, 1984's arcade shooter Vulgus. It was to build on its predecessor by adding stages and boss fights, as opposed to the endlessly looping Vulgus, and after beating the game, Titan Warriors loops with the difficulty increasing dramatically. Titan Warriors looks like a decent little vertical shooter and has a soundtrack from the composer behind Strider and Bionic Commando on the NES. There's also a complete playable prototype available online if you're interested in trying it, although I'm unsure why it wasn't released. Chuck Yeager's Fighter Combat was a planned combat flight sim for the NES featuring the titular Chuck Yeager, who was the first pilot to be confirmed to fly faster than the speed of sound. In 1991, EA published Chuck Yeager's Air Combat for the PC, also a flight sim, which featured Chuck as a consultant and included his digitised voice. The NES game didn't surface until 2010 when a prototype appeared on eBay. Bidding ended on a whopping $2,700 and was bought by a pair wishing to preserve the software. They eventually produced a limited run of 150 reproduction carts, and then very generously released the ROM online. The game by all accounts is an enjoyable flight sim and is quite advanced for an NES game. It also, much like its PC counterpart, features Chuck's digitised voice, which is uncommon for the console. Robocop vs Terminator was released for several Sega and Nintendo consoles between 93 and 95, based on the comic book series of the same name. An NES version was also developed, but was cancelled when Virgin deemed the console to be commercially obsolete. Probably due to hardware limitations, the NES version was a different game than that of the released versions, featuring some pretty uninspired gameplay. Greg Tavares, who designed and programmed MC Kids on the NES, as well as programming numerous games for various systems and did artwork for Sid Meier's Pirates, was tasked with bringing Robocop vs Terminator to the 8-bit console. The game was completely unknown publicly to have ever been in development until 1998, when Greg mentioned the game during an interview. He went on to admit that it was an awful game, partly due to the fact that the artist struggled to cope with the console's limitations, and the designer being a recently promoted playtester who Greg claims didn't know what he was doing. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not, shortly after this interview a ROM of the beta of Robocop vs Terminator was released online. Happy Camper was developed for the NES by Color Dreams, initially intended to have gameplay akin to Paperboy or California Games, with the playable character riding a skateboard. Developmental issues led to the game becoming a run and gun, but Happy Camper retained its outdoor theme. Gameplay, as I said, is sort of a run and gun, with the character throwing some sort of projectiles at what I assume are weird frog-like aliens. Gameplay looks a bit samey, and there doesn't seem to be much variety in terms of enemy types. The game was reportedly ridiculously hard, with very few of the development team or playtesters being able to even beat the first level. By the time the difficulty had been tweaked, releasing Happy Camper wasn't financially viable, and it was cancelled. Bioforce 8 was first shown at CES in June of 1991 and then in Nintendo Power 2 months later. The premise of this game is pretty nuts. You play as a super strong chimpanzee who uses wrestling moves such as suplexes to defeat his foes. Nintendo Power teased the game a few times and even sang its praises before abruptly announcing its cancellation in April 1992. For years, Nintendo fans would discuss online whether or not Bioforce 8 ever actually existed, and posited that it may have been a hoax. It didn't help that a prototype never surfaced, and the developers were tight-lipped on the subject. A prototype did eventually appear online, but that turned out to be a hoax. Then, in 2010, a prototype cart emerged on a Japanese Yahoo auction. After a collaborative effort for funds, the copy was bought for $2,700 and turned out to be legit. The first thing that stands out with Bioforce 8 is the sheer speed of the chimp's movement, which ties in with Nintendo Power's comments years earlier with their claim that Bioforce 8 featured some of the fastest scrolling ever on the NES. Other than that, the combat and movement do look pretty fun, although some of the generic conveyor belt platforming sections look pretty drab. Diver Eon Man is a sci-fi action platformer developed by AI and to be published by Taito. The game was completely finished by 1993 and even had a full review and strategy guide in Nintendo Power early that year. Time Diver started life as a sequel to Wrath of the Black Manta. Its story is set 60 years in the future, where crime is virtually eradicated thanks to technology called the Clear System. That is, until a crime syndicate called Rome Drux attempts to change all that by travelling back in time to prevent the Clear System's creation. The protagonist must travel through time to stop them. The game features 5 levels which are randomised except for the first, which is set in the peaceful 1993. The other 4 randomised levels are Wild West 1882, a devastated version of 93, and both peaceful and devastated versions of 2052. The player has various weapons at their disposal, including the default laser, Earthquake, which kills all enemies on screen, and Stopwatch, which briefly stops time. A playable ROM of Time Diver was leaked online if you want to give it a whirl. Airball was released on numerous systems in 1987, originally on the Dragon 32 and TRS-80, and then ported to the Amiga, ST, DOS, Atari, and later the Game Boy Advance. An isometric puzzle game in which you control an inflated ball and must navigate your way through a maze a single screen at a time. Inflating stations are scattered throughout the maze which can be used to inflate the ball and also function as checkpoints. Controls are simple, with 4 directional movements and jump, and an on-screen gauge displays the ball's air level. The player must prevent the ball from deflating and also avoid hazards such as spikes which will cause it to burst, while collecting gems which award points. An NES port of Airball was in development but was for some reason cancelled. Several different prototypes have emerged, although none complete, and repro carts are available from Retro Zone. Buzz and Bulldog was an unlicensed NES game developed in Korea under the name Coco Adventure. It was due to be brought to the West by Innovation Technology in 1993, but for some reason was never released. It stars the titular Coco, along with a second playable character called Susie. Gameplay is standard platformer fare, and both characters have a spin kick attack. Question mark boxes strewn throughout the levels grant various bonuses, including a power-up which will grant the player a double jump, or the ability to glide if the double jump is already acquired. You can play as either character or as both in multiplayer mode, and the game has 5 stages, each containing 3 levels and a boss fight, and at the game's end there's a boss rush before fighting the final boss. Prototypes of the Western version Buzz and Bulldog have surfaced online. The main character is renamed Buzz, and Susie is replaced by a male character called Bulldog, but the gameplay remains the same. The prototype's available to download online, and reproduction carts have also been produced. I'd say that if you're going to try only one game on this list, it should be this. The visuals and gameplay are spot on for an NES game, and it reminds me of Master System or even Mega Drive platformers like Alex Kidd or Kid Chameleon. Definitely one to check out. The California Raisins The Great Escape was developed by Radiance for the NES and was due to be published by Capcom in 1990. Based on the California Raisins mascots, it was cancelled due to a dip in raisin sales which led to a decline in the character's popularity. The player makes their way through 5 platforming stages on a mission to rescue band members and their musical notes from a group of rival musicians. Besides the standard platforming controls, the player can moonwalk by pressing select, collect various power-ups and bonuses, and can throw grape jelly beans to defeat enemies. Like other Capcom platformers on the system, the first 4 levels can be played in any order, with the 5th being unlocked once all the musical notes have been collected. The game must have been cancelled late on in development, as it's largely complete. Dreamworld Poky was developed by Codemasters for the NES and Sega Game Gear and was created by the Oliver twins, famed for their series of Dizzy games. Although it was coded in 1993 and was cancelled for some reason, perhaps due to the console's dwindling popularity, it wasn't until years later that it surfaced. Around the time of Dizzy's 25th anniversary, the source code for Dreamworld Poky appeared online and was compiled into a working ROM. The Oliver twins started a Kickstarter to bring physical copies of the game to the NES with a modest target of £6,000. This was met in only a few days, with the project ending on over £28,000. Dreamworld Poky is another fantastic looking platformer which has similarities to the Dizzy games and is definitely worth playing, especially if you're a fan of the Oliver twins. Zybots is an 80s arcade game from Atari which is a 3D third-person maze runner / shooter. The player runs through the maze fighting robots called Zybots who are hell-bent on destroying mankind. 2 playable characters are available, Major Rock Hardy and Captain Ace Gunn. Numerous home ports were released and an NES port was in the works from Tengen, but was cancelled despite being almost finished. A prototype was leaked online, so it's out there if you wanted to try it out. So that was 15 of the many unreleased NES games. Let me know if any of them tickle your fancy, and as always, thanks for watching. If you're interested in seeing some cancelled games for other Nintendo consoles like the Super Nintendo or Nintendo 64, you can click on this link here.